Welcome to the second lecture of our Great Explorers course. What I'd like to do is start off with some of the slides that we saw in the last lecture and then connect to our lecture 2. So assuming that you see my presentation, let me start with this slide here, in which I listed some of the major discoveries or explorations that took place at the end of, from the 17th century onward, polar explorations. And what I'd like to do is cover some of them very briefly before we get on to the second lecture. And I don't want to repeat what I said in the last lecture, I just want to sort of go briefly through it. So we talked about Nansen's pioneering crossing of Greenland and how he managed to do this 1,200 kilometers trip safely from east to west, together with his companion, Johannessen. And a few years later, the same Nansen goes to the North Pole. He builds a formidable ship called the Fram. In Norwegian, Fram is forward. And here's a picture of this very famous ship. He goes with the Fram into the into the Arctic zone, and he deliberately and purposefully locks the ship into the ice with the hope that the currents will take him in a sort of a counterclockwise movement toward the pole. And he was right in this theory. It took about 7 to 8 months, and the ship got very close to the pole, about 1,000 kilometers from the pole. And by the way, today you can see this ship in Oslo. There's a special museum dedicated to it. It's quite a thrill to visit it if you took my course. And here you see the map showing the progress of the Fram through the ice. It goes from left to right. And he started off at Spitsbergen, which is sort of a north part of Norway. And went, actually, the map is a little bit confusing because at the beginning he went south. He went all the way to Siberia. And if you look at the bottom of the map, you see how the ship went along the shores of Siberia. Then he went north and came to about, as I said, about 1,000 kilometers from the pole. And then Nansen and his colleague Johannessen strike out on skis and sledges. And the two of them managed to get to about 500 kilometers from the pole, which is considered a world record. They were the first humans who got that close. And they even managed to go back safely and come home alive. The whole trip took more than 2 years. And this is a picture of them in Spitsbergen upon their return. Just a few years later, Amundsen, another great Norwegian, but during this time an unknown young explorer, discovers what is known as the Northwest Passage. The Northwest Passage is an attempt to go from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean by boat or by ship. And Amundsen managed to do it in a spectacular trip that you can see here in front of you. We don't have pictures of Amundsen when he was a young man, only much later on when he was a very well-known explorer. Back then he was in his 20s. He made this trip solo, and he went in a small sailboat equipped with everything that he needed to survive in the ocean and on the ice. And he managed to find a path, as you see, south of Greenland, north of Newfoundland. He somehow needled his way through the north end of Canada, Yukon territory, got to what is now Alaska, and basically hugged the coast and managed to go around Alaska, south through the Aleutian Islands, another 1,500 kilometers or so on the west shore of North America. And at some point, he found himself in San Francisco. He walked into a telegram office and sent a telegram home saying just 3 words, "I made it." And this was obviously considered a fantastic achievement. And Amundsen became internationally known as a very important explorer. So this was his first important landmark. And shifting our attention south, because so far we talked only about the northern hemisphere, the South Pole still remained the most desired, elusive, and sort of challenging place to get to on Earth. It was the Holy Grail. That's where every serious explorer wanted to get one way or another. And so in 1902, a team of 3 men led by Captain Robert Falcon Scott, a British, made it to about 1,000 kilometers from the South Pole. And I gave you a reading to read about this trip. On the one hand, it was an important achievement, once again, a world record. But on the other hand, it was a miserable trip, as you read in the text that I gave you. And Scott was a competent sea captain, but he was a very problematic leader of men, especially under distress, as you read in the text. And during this trip, Shackleton, who was, one of the team members, I think it was Shackleton, Wilson, and Scott, Shackleton fell ill and slowed down the progress of the team. Scott became extremely resentful to Scott because of these delays. Scott to Shackleton. And a great animosity began to build between these 2 individuals. But that's a side story that we will pick up when we talk about Shackleton. For now, what's important to know is that this trip was important not only because they made it to a world record to the South Pole, but also in this trip, Scott discovered McMurdo Bay, the place of landing, which became the most important point of departure for polar explorations. So this was a major discovery, which is credited with justice to Scott. And several other missions that continued after Scott, several years after them, began in McMurdo Bay. In particular, 7 years after this, as I said, important and miserable expedition, Shackleton strikes out to give it a try also. And he goes on a ship called Nimrod, and the trip is extremely successful. He lands in McMurdo Bay, even though Scott forbids him from doing so. In fact, before Shackleton left England, Scott forced him to sign an agreement, a letter, a written agreement in which Shackleton agreed not to land in McMurdo Bay. I realize that today it sounds completely ridiculous, but you have to understand that back then, competition was not necessarily considered a virtue. In fact, among British gentlemen, competition in exploration was considered bad behavior. In other words, if you discovered a particular region in the world, it was considered yours, so to speak, exclusively yours until you get bored of it. Okay, so if you discovered a point of landing, if someone else wanted to use it, he or she had to get your approval. Once again, today it sounds ridiculous, but back then it was considered a gentlemanly behavior. So Shackleton, poor Shackleton, traveled to Antarctica. He tried to find a landing on the ice shelf. He couldn't find any reasonable landing. Time was getting out of control. So at some point he gave up, and with very hard feelings, he betrayed what he wrote in the contract, in the agreement, and landed in McMurdo Bay. From there, he went with 2 more men to the pole, and it was a fantastic success because they made it to 100 kilometers from the pole, an unbelievable achievement. When they got to 100 kilometers from the pole, they were in a desperate situation. They were out of food, out of fuel, extremely fatigued. And Shackleton made a heroic decision to turn back and at least save their lives and give up the ultimate goal to actually touch the pole. So he returns to England and is received like a national hero. Back then there was no internet, no Facebook, no social media. If you came up with a fantastic story like this one, it was immediately published and disseminated in the newspapers, in the press. That's what people read. There were no competition in terms of other publications, and therefore Shackleton becomes a hero, just like Scott and Amundsen before him. So that's Shackleton's farthest south in 1909. And this is the beginning of today's lecture about Amundsen and Scott. So the race to the South Pole, which took place between roughly 1909 and 1911, is probably the greatest competition that we know of between 2 explorers. It is also a tragic drama of Shakespearean proportions, complete with love, hate, envy, deception, revenge, sweet victory, bitter defeat, and of course, death. The heroes of this story are Roald Amundsen, a Norwegian explorer, and Robert Falcon Scott, a British naval officer. When our story begins, Scott and Amundsen are in their mid-30s, and both of them are established explorers with proven records and international reputation. Both of them are driven by a burning desire for fame and achievement, but the sources of these desires are very different. Amundsen was a Viking, and for him, the outdoor and just getting to new places was his life ambition. At the same time, Scott was born and raised in a middle-class, low-income family. And as you may know, the British society back then, and also today, is highly stratified into social classes. And if you're stuck in the middle class and you want to somehow get recognition and begin to get all these ridiculous titles of SER, FRS, CBE, they have hundreds of 3-letter titles. If you want to be titled, then the easiest way to do it back in the 19th century was to join or lead an exploration. So Scott was a social climber, and his goal was not necessarily driven by sort of the quote unquote real ambition to conquer geographical landmarks, but more so, he wanted he was craving honor and respect. He was also burning from revenge because he couldn't bear the fact that Shackleton, who was his subordinate and junior team members, managed to outdo him and just 2 years earlier managed to get to 100 kilometers from the pole, which completely erased the previous achievement of Scott. So, so his motivation was kind of problematic compared to Amundsen. Also, if you recall, hold on a minute. All right, I think I'll skip that for the sake of time, because if I'll go on talking, this can go for hours and hours. So let me move forward. And here is the arena. This is where this epic race took place. We're looking at Antarctica, which, as I said in the last lecture, is about twice as large as Australia. And what we see here are traces of the trails of, first of all, Scott in blue and Amundsen in red. As you see, they began in 2 different locations, separated by a distance of about 700 kilometers. And and what we see here is kind of a zoom in on both tracks. You can see Scott on the right and Amundsen on the left. Just to remind you what it takes to get there, first of all, you have to sail for about 18,000 kilometers, which takes anything from 3 to 6 months in the various oceans of the world to get from England or Norway to New Zealand. And then from New Zealand, you sail to Antarctica. And then after spending about 8 months of winter on the ice, you begin your attack on the pole. It's about 600 kilometers of sledging using dogs or hauling or whatever, or skiing. Then you have to cross the transatlantic mountain range, which is quite a formidable mountain range, completely icy, full of glaciers, very difficult to climb. It's about 3,000 kilometers long. It cuts through all of Antarctica. It's like the Andes of Antarctica. And once you get over this range, you get to what is known as the polar plateau, which is an ice desert, flat with a slight incline. And you continue to climb until you get to the pole, which is about 3,000 meters high. This was a big surprise, by the way. No one thought that the pole was that high. People thought that it was flat, but in fact, it takes quite an effort to simply climb to that height in these conditions. And so altogether, it's about 1,200 kilometers trip. And you have 4 months to make this trip and go all the way back. Okay, so it's about 2,800 kilometers round trip. And if you will not be back on time, you're going to miss your ship. And if you miss your ship, you're going to spend another 8 months of winter on the ice until next year, when the next ship will manage to break the ice and come to pick you up. So altogether, on average, it takes about 3 years to go to the pole. So it's quite a formidable trip. Now, as usual in explorations, there are many motivations to explore, and some of them are personal, others are political. And in the case of Norway, there was a great deal of national pride at stake. And Amundsen wrote in his memoir, for a small nation like Norway, it's important to compete in international challenges when the opportunity arises, and preferably at those fields at which we are especially adapted. That's smart. Here we stand on equal footing with the big nations. You have to realize that back then, in 1909, Norway was a new country, a new nation, because it was only in 1905 that it gained its independence from Sweden. You know, before that, Norway was part of Sweden. Before that, it was part of Denmark. So only in 1905, the Norwegian people gained independence. And I think in this backdrop, this quote from Amundsen makes a lot of sense. And then he wrote, by making the biggest possible efforts in the field of exploration, art and science, we can demonstrate our right to exist as an independent nation and show our significance to the world. Every such effort, big or small, will help to give our people self-confidence at home and recognition abroad. So exploration, art, like the famous painter Edward Munch, music, Sibelius. What Amundsen said, there are some areas in which we can play in the big boys game and actually beat them, even though we were such a small and humble country. And of course, this was before oil was discovered in Norway. Now, at the same time, England is exactly the opposite. England is the leader of the world. The British Empire, in its highest days, was, just to give you an idea, it was about 5 times as large as the Roman Empire. It was by far the largest empire that the world ever knew. And there was the saying that the sun never sets in the British Empire because it was spread geographically all over the world. Now, back during this time, the British Empire was in decline. They lost, sort of most dramatically, they lost the American colonies. So on this map, you don't see red in what is now America, but they still owned India and great parts of Africa and great parts of Canada and all sorts of other areas in the Far East. Here's another map. The maps, change every few years when more nations kick out the British from their countries. But basically, it was still an incredible empire. And this also gave them a great deal of pride. And here's a typical quote: "This happy breed of men, this little world, this precious stone set in silver steel," speaking about the British Islands, "which serves it in the office of a wall. It is the sea that is the wall that separates England, from the continent. This blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England, this nurse, this teeming womb of royal kings, this land of such dear souls, this dear, dear land." So you can sense the patriotic fervor in which people like Scott were brought up, educated, and operated. So the president of the Royal Geographic Society writes that Scott is going to prove that the manhood of our nation is not dead and that the characteristics of our ancestors who won the great empires still flourish among us. So as you see, this was not sort of a personal adventure. This was a national adventure going to the South Pole, backed by, big money, lots of organizations, and the whole public was standing and cheering behind Scott. At the pole, Britannia's pretty sure to reach her goal. Her ever conquering legions will annex those distant regions and make a new dominion of the pole. Perhaps, a very powerful example of the colonial objective of British politics back then. It's a matter of conquering. See, Amundsen didn't want to conquer anything. He just wanted to get there and spend great time on the ice. For Scott and England, it was a completely different story. Now, meanwhile, in the North Pole, or actually, let me backtrack a little bit, check something in my notes. Hold on a minute. And just make sure that I'm not skipping important chapters in my story. So that's one small detail that I forgot to tell you, which is terribly important. And that is that Amundsen planned to go to the North Pole, not to the South Pole. And Scott was going south. And they were living roughly during the same time. They knew each other. They met each other twice, I think, once in Norway, once in England. And they compared notes, so to speak, and decided that, or I'm not sure if they coordinated it, but the goal of Amundsen was to go to the North Pole once again, and Scott was destined to the South Pole. But here is what happened meantime in the South Pole. Basically, two American explorers, Frederick Cook and Robert Peary, were trying to get to the North Pole. Peary was a formidable explorer, and Cook was a little bit of a crook, in fact, and but he was also a competent explorer. And what happened was that they came back to New York and announced that they made it to the North Pole separately. They were competing against each other. And yet neither of them could produce evidence that they actually made it to the pole. They made it alone, or I think Peary was accompanied by one Eskimo. And it wasn't sufficient to establish proof that they were actually in the pole. So the whole issue was kind of shredded in uncertainty. And for Amundsen, it was quite a disaster because he wanted to go to the pole. And now it seemed like, you know, maybe someone else made it to the pole before him. So many years later, he wrote in his memoir, "I clearly understood that my original plan to go to the North Pole was in jeopardy. If the expedition was to be saved, I had to act quickly and without hesitation. Nothing else remained for me to do than try to solve the last greatest mystery, the South Pole." So something quite incredible happened. Amundsen continued to make preparations to go to the North Pole. He didn't tell anyone, not even Nansen, which was a close friend of him and a mentor, not even Nansen knew that his real plan was to go south. And one reason why he didn't disclose to anyone his true destination was because he knew that if Scott will get word that Amundsen is going south, he will accelerate his preparations, and Amundsen will have a harder start. So this grand story that we are telling here begins with a fantastic chapter of deception. No one even knows that Amundsen is in the game. And this behavior, by the way, will be something that will continue to torment him for the rest of his career, as we'll see later on. Now, I want to say a few words about the vessels or the ships. And what we see on the right is the Terra Nova, which is a British ship, which was a merchant ship which was converted for exploration. And this was the ship with which Scott went south. And it wasn't really built for Arctic sailing. So it had all sorts of problems going south. And on the left, we see the magnificent Fram, which was built by Nansen about 15 years earlier, which was probably the strongest wooden ship in the world back then, which was especially built for Arctic sailing. It was very powerful and wide and made of the best possible wood. And it could sustain the pressure of ice. And Nansen, as sort of a gesture of friendship and support, gave the Fram to Amundsen to go with to the South Pole. So these were the two vessels with which our two protagonists are beginning their trip. And let me say a few words about the people involved. First of all, Scott went with 65 people on board of the Terra Nova, and Amundsen went with 13. Which already tells you something about the different attitudes and the different degrees of confidence that they had in themselves and in their men. The team of Amundsen was quite simply a team of supermen. Every one of them was handpicked, not only because he had tremendous physical and mental stamina, but also because he was an expert in some trade. So one was a master carpenter, and the other one was an expert in ironwork. And the person that you see here, Helmer Hansen, was a master of dogs. And another one was a world champion in cross-country skiing. And you can see from this photograph, I think, the mastery that Helmer Hansen had. You can see it in his body language. You know, the way he stands and looks at the dogs, and the way the dogs are seated to his feet like puppies. This is a person who knew how to handle dogs. Now, these dogs were ferocious animals and very wild beasts, and it took an expert to feed them, handle them, treat them, and so on. And Hansen was, you know, as qualified as any other person in the world, or maybe the best in the world, in this very peculiar and esoteric work. Another member of the team was Olav Bjaaland, who was an international champion of skiing. And you have to realize that back then, skis were not the synthetic boards that we have today. They were made of wood. And therefore, you had to know a lot about wood, about age, grain, varnish, treatment, how the wood expands or shrinks in different temperatures. Every day you have to wax it in a different way, depending on the weather. So it also took a tremendous expertise, and Olav Bjaaland was probably, once again, the best in the world, or somewhere at the top of the world in this trade. They also, during this time, they invented what is known as the cross-country binding, in which, as you see in the picture, you can lift your foot, so you can not only ski but also walk when you go uphill. All these little details are obviously extremely important, and Olav Bjaaland was a top-notch person in this field. Now, at the same time, you know, the British had also a wonderful team of what I call officers and gentlemen. Every one of them was incredibly strong, physically, mentally, but they had a complete ignorance of ice and snow. And let me check my notes for a minute, hold on. Yeah. So Scott's preparations for the polar expedition in terms of equipment and supplies was both sloppy and expensive. For example, he had a natural dislike and distrust of dogs. Instead of dogs, he planned to use ponies. And this was absolutely crazy because ponies were not adopted to operate in sub-freezing temperatures. And besides, no one tried it before. You don't want to do in the pole something that no one tried before. You know, at least you want to minimize this category of what you're trying to do. And also, Scott ordered to build motorized sledges, which were terribly expensive and completely unreliable. Now, I must say, I read many books about explorations and history books, and recently I read a book about the Gallipoli battle in World War I, which was led by Churchill, at least as the major politician back then. And I must tell you, that the British culture has a very long tradition of schlep. The British were almost proud of getting into tremendous adventures with little or no preparation. They had a pervert love of crisis. And without saying so explicitly, they assumed that the great British spirit, the spirit of creativity, talent, and stamina will somehow prevail and win the game in the face of almost criminal lack of preparation. After all, they were masters of the world. So, there's no question that this state of mind has put them in a very sort of dangerous position of hubris, and which may lead and did lead to significant disasters, not only in the pole, but in many other places in the world as well. So this was the state of mind of the British, great people, extremely talented, zero preparation, or not zero preparation, but numerous wrong decisions and badly planned, supplied, and bad plans in general. So we see here Scott sitting in what is today called the Scott Hut, which he built in McMurdo Bay. They had to spend 8 months on the ice, waiting, for the time in which they'll go to the pole. And they spent them in endless activities. There was not a moment of boredom. They were making side expeditions to different areas around their winter camp. They were preparing their equipment, preparing food, beginning to plan and actually go in the direction of the pole as much as they could, and coming back, laying supplies, depots along the way. That's what both expeditions did during the winter. And here we see the British transportation system or plan, which was based on these very poor ponies that you see in the top right, who survived just something like 2 or 3 months before all of them died, the poor beasts. And on the top left, you see the motorized sledge, which worked for about 1 or 2 hours before it broke down. And in fact, they had 3 sledges. 2 of them broke into the ice and went down into the water. And the third one became completely useless. So what do you do if you don't trust dogs and your ponies are dead and the sledges don't work? Well, you resort to the British technique known as man-hauling. So every man has a harness which he ties to the sledge, and you begin to schlep those half-a-ton sledges as much as you can and hope that you'll somehow make it. So this was the British transportation plan. And here's something that the scientific director of Scott's expedition wrote many years later. Scott had no experience of expedition equipment. On questions of furs, sledges, ski, etc. His ignorance is appalling. He does not seem at all conscious of these facts or inclines to get the experience necessary. So this was obviously a recipe for disaster. Quite reminiscent of some of the leaders of the world that we have today. Here is the Norwegian transportation plan, which was based mostly on one thing: dogs. I think I told you in the previous lecture that Amundsen spent about 1.5 years living with Eskimos. He admired the Eskimos. He thought that the Eskimos were the kings of of their ecosystem. And he admired their ability to survive on the ice. At the same time, this was quite unique because, the British, the French, the cultivated Europeans thought about Eskimos as miserable, wretched people who lived, in a Stone Age life somewhere in the margin of civilization. And surely there's nothing that we, the British, can possibly learn from Eskimos. So, very different attitudes. Amundsen resolved that if he will go to the pole, he will go there like an Eskimo, using dogs, using furs, using igloos, using all the survival skills that he learned when he spent time with the Eskimos before. He was also a meticulous planner, Amundsen, and every article in his mission was planned and made by him and the other men in the expedition. For example, look at these boxes that sit on the sledges. One innovation that Amundsen came with is that the openings of these boxes were sideways. So you could open a box and get into the supplies without unpacking the sledge. A small detail, but you see, a small detail like this can spell out the difference between life and death. Because if you have to stop and unpack the sledge and exert energy and waste time and do it like 3 or 4 times a day, this can be, that's all it takes to either lose the race or even lose your life. So he did this. He also realized, for example, just to give you an idea of the details that he planned. He knew that diarrhea can be a disastrous problem on the ice. In Hebrew, shilshul. So he fortified his pemmican, his canned meat, with things like rice and peas, afuna, to avoid and to give fiber and avoid diarrhea. And numerous hundreds of such little details spell the difference between success and failure. And Amundsen was a master planner, and he had a genius for logistics and preparation. Now, a few words about navigation and planning the route. What you see here is a book that Shackleton published after he came back from the pole, when he made his 100 kilometers approach. And in this book, he described both the trip, the hardship that they went through, but he also provided excellent maps. He was going in a completely uncharted territory, and he mapped all the way to the pole. So this book became a precious resource both for Scott and for Amundsen. Both Scott and Amundsen studied this book very carefully and took it with them to the pole. It became like their Bible in terms of topography. Now, Amundsen, in reading Shackleton's memories or Shackleton's account, learned a few more things. He also learned that Shackleton was a very bad planner, just like Scott, and he didn't take enough food, he didn't take enough fuel, didn't take enough supplies, didn't build enough depots, and he was flirting with disaster. And when Amundsen read that, he said to himself, I have tremendous respect to Shackleton's bravery and courage, but here's an example of how not to go to the pole. And the biggest lesson that Amundsen learned from Shackleton's book was that he needed a huge margin, a huge margin for error. And he decided that he's going to take twice as much food, twice as much fuel, twice as much everything to the pole, because he didn't want to be in a situation in which you have to constantly fight for your life. And that's one reason why he went only with 13 people. Because, you know, one way to double your supplies is to cut the number of people by 2. And that's what he did. He had less people, more supplies, and this was one of the secrets behind his great success. After spending 8 months on the ice, the Norwegians begin to strike out. Before that, I should say a few more things about wintering on the ice. So they spent 8 months preparing for this moment. And during this 8 months, I'm talking now about the Norwegians, they killed about 300 seals, and they fished a few tons of fish, and they smoked the meat and prepared, you know, several tons of food, both for them and for the 100 dogs that they had to feed. So there were 13 people and 100 dogs on the ice. The dogs, by the way, became, you know, almost like their children. They were a constant supply of amusement and diversion and good humor. And so they were just, you know, members of the team, just like the men. And so they made all these preparations. They created all the equipment that they needed: sleeping bags, boots, moccasins, furs. Everything was made on the ice in the Norwegian camp. And every man had a little shop. Actually, it began on the frame. Even on the frame, when they were sailing to Antarctica, every man had a little shop in which he worked and worked on the equipment that he specialized in. And in various books that I read, there are very nice descriptions of how Amundsen visits these shops. And, you know, he never stepped into the shop, into the little place where the men worked, until he was invited to come in. And when he was invited to come in, he always congratulated the man for the great job that he was doing. You know, this was going on the frame, on the way to Antarctica. And now that I mentioned this, I want to say a few words about what happened in the Terra Nova on the way to Antarctica. Well, in New Zealand, Scott stopped in order to victualate and, you know, put more supplies on the ship. And one thing that he put on the ship was about 50 ponies. These are the ponies that, you know, died very soon later on. But back then, you know, they were very energetic and healthy. They came from Manchuria. They were the best ponies in the world. So he put them on the boat. And then they started to sail south to Antarctica. And the poor ponies were locked in cages, completely exposed to the elements, to the snow, to the sleet, to the rain. And actually they began dying right there. They were on the upper deck. And I'm sorry to get into details, but this was a wooden deck. And the people were living under the deck in hammocks of saline. And receiving the urine and the various excrements of the ponies from above, going through the creeks. It was a complete nightmare, you know, going to Antarctica on this ship. At the same time, Amundsen is going in the frame. Every team member has his own cabin and very nice sailing and comfortable. Quite a happy group going down to to conquer or to get to the South Pole. I'm saying this because, you know, all these things add up at the end. You know, this course is also about leadership. And you have to know that in leadership, it's not one grand act. It's many different gestures, hundreds of different things that you do, and they all add up at the end. And if your men are comfortable and treated well, with respect, with dignity, at some point it will pay back. It may be 6 months down the road, but it will pay back. And if you treat your men miserably, it will also pay back sort of in a negative way. So I also wanted to say a few words about the base camps, and let me see if it's later on in the talk. Hold on with me for a minute. Yes, it is. Okay. So going back to Scott, Scott knew exactly where he was going because he had Shackleton's books and maps. The plan was laid out, and there was no uncertainty, at least about the route that they were going to take. So this was a great advantage that Scott had. Now, Amundsen, on the other hand, had to strike into new territory. But I'll get to this in the next slide. So, you know, let me talk about this slide for a minute. What we see here are the winter bases. So on the top right, we see Scott's hut. By the way, it still stands there. You can visit it. Today it's a museum. And this is McMurdo Bay. As you see, it's what is known in Latin as terra firma. This is land. You know, it's not ice, it's real rocks during summertime. And very close to the sea. On what is known as Ross Island, which during the winter becomes connected to the mainland. We'll see it later on. Actually, you see it at the bottom map. You see that the tip of this, the tip of the continent is actually an island where you see two volcanoes, Erebus and Terror. We'll talk about them later on. So this is Scott's location, which was a fantastic landing place. Perhaps the only reasonable place to land the ship and to land an expedition in a segment of maybe 1,000 kilometers along the ice shelf. And Amundsen was not allowed, obviously, to land in McMurdo Bay. So he had a big problem where to start his landing. And by the way, I also forgot to tell you, there's so many details to remember, that at some point, after leaving Oslo, they left through what is known as the Christiana Fjord in Oslo, and they began to sail at the beginning west through the North Sea. And then instead of going north, all of a sudden, Amundsen turns south. And the men are surprised and they don't understand what's going on because everyone thought that he was going to the North Pole. And it was at this point that Amundsen finally opened his mouth and shared this huge secret with the team that they're actually going to the South Pole. Everyone was extremely excited and happy to hear about the tremendous adventure that they were going to have. So he continued to sail south for another 2 months or so. When he got closer and closer to New Zealand, he sent a telegram to Scott. And the telegram said, I have to find it, but I'm not sure that I will. The telegram said, Captain Scott, I wish to inform you that I'm proceeding to Antarctica. Signed, Amundsen. Now, you can imagine that Scott was completely shocked because up until then, the sailing of Scott, you know, from Europe to South Africa and through the Indian Ocean to New Zealand, it was a big festival. You know, in every port that they came, there were bands, orchestras playing and parades and so on. They were treated as tremendous heroes before they even set foot on Antarctica. So in one brief moment, this festive sailing with all the parties and celebrations, all of a sudden, it became a desperate race. Scott knew that Amundsen was a formidable explorer, and he became extremely anxious and edgy. And these reactions were added to his usual moody and unstable behavior. And when Scott felt defensive, as it was back then, after getting this telegram, he became a tyrant and the bully. And the men on the Terra Nova felt that something, very wrong was happening with their leader. Now, if you read the text that I gave you, and I hope very much that you do, you saw this behavior also on the trip with the Shackleton several years before. Now, Scott was a very powerful person, physically speaking. And but as I just told you, he was also a bully. And there's an English word called martinet. Martinet is a disciplinarian, someone who expects everyone to obey everything that he says, irrespective if it's reasonable or not. So this was Scott. And he always pushed his men to the very limit of almost dying of effort. He was, instead of, that's another lesson about leadership. When you go with a team of very capable people, mind you, these are very capable people. And if someone begins to complain that he is ill or weak or losing it, well, there are two ways to deal with it. You can either ignore and continue to push forward, or you can show empathy and try to deal with the problem somehow. Now, Scott always aimed to the strongest person in the team, which almost always was himself. So if you have to decide how many kilometers you go on the ice every day, he would measure it according to his personal ability, and everyone else had to somehow match up with his pace. And yet, once again, I want to remind you, these people are very capable individuals. So if someone complains, maybe, you want to take it seriously and show empathy, because you cannot just dump him behind you and continue without him. You have to take him somehow with you. So Scott would build resentment and contempt to the weak link in the team. And this created a very bad team spirit. And people felt that there was a tremendous sort of negative energy going on between Scott and Shackleton, because if you remember, it was Shackleton that fell ill in this first expedition. He became invalid, and he had to be taken on a sledge, which made Scott crazy, because he was slowing down the team. And Amundsen had one such problem. I will describe it later, but with Amundsen, the trick was not to get into such situations to begin with, okay? And with careful planning, with good supplies, with tremendous margin for error, there's no need that people will get tired, lose their energy, and so on. But we'll get back to these things later on. So Amundsen was approaching Antarctica after sending the famous telegram and letting the truth out. And he was looking for a place to land. And back then, there was a preconception that you cannot build a permanent camp on the ice shelf. You must look for some solid ground. But Amundsen said, why not? If I'll find a nice opening where I can park my boat, my ship, for a few days and unload everything and get the hell out of there, why not do that? And that's exactly what he did. He discovered this place called the Bay of Whales and went with the ship all the way in and landed the supplies there. He wrote in his memoirs, "I do not belong to the class of explorers who believe that the polar sea has been created for myself alone." Obviously, he's talking about Scott. "My view is the diametrically opposite. The more, the merrier, simultaneously and at the same place if you like. Nothing stimulates more like competition. The sporting spirit ought to reign in these regions. First comes, first serves." Once again, I want to remind you, it would have been much more sensible if he landed close to Scott in a good known place and start from there on equal grounds, but he was forced to find another place, and that's what he did. It turned out, in retrospect, that this point of departure was actually very good, because first of all, there was no problem whatsoever to build a winter camp on the ice. It worked perfectly okay. Of course, no one knew it back then, but Amundsen proved it. And also, it was about 200 kilometers closer to the pole. So this was, yet another wonderful bonus that he got for his pioneering decision. After putting all the supplies on the ice, he sends his ship back to Buenos Aires. They came from New Zealand, but he decided to go to Buenos Aires, and he leaves his captain with these instructions, written instructions. The earlier you can force your way to the barrier, he's talking about the CPEC, in 1912, which is 1 year from now, the better. I give no time, as everything depends on circumstances. And I leave it up to you to act accordingly to your judgment. For the rest, I give you complete freedom of action in everything concerning the interests of the expedition. If on returning to the barrier, you should find that I'm prevented by sickness or death from taking over the leadership of the expedition, I give it into your hands. So, let me try to open up for a question in Zoom and see how it will go. I want you to put yourself in the shoes of Captain Nielsen and tell me, how do you feel after you get these written instructions? What's the feeling that you get? If anyone wants to offer an answer, I'll be happy to hear it.
It's an amazing feeling of trust, that someone trusts you and is putting his faith in your hand. It gives you also a great sense of responsibility.
Right. I think that that's exactly what I felt when I read this, and I feel like I'm not only I know the plan. I'm one of the owners of the plan. I'm responsible just as anyone, just as not anyone, but just as Amundsen is responsible for what's happening on the ice. I'm responsible for everything else, and complete trust. And that's another thing that I want to share with you. After reading numerous books about such expeditions, there's a very amusing history of written notes that people left each other. A king gives a written note to Columbus. President Jefferson leaves written notes to Lewis and Clark before they set out. You always had to get it in writing, and this was like your beacon. That's what you. In moments of uncertainty, you would read your notes and understand or try to figure out what is it that you have to do. Almost always, these notes are over-specified. The person that gives the notes has an illusion of control. He thinks that he knows exactly what to do. and he gives you very specific instructions. And then circumstances kick in, the situation changes, and you cannot really follow the written notes that you got. And then disasters begin to happen. In this written note, we see the exact, I think, amount of freedom that one should get in order to have the necessary flexibility and agility to perform well in the face of uncertainty. So this is the Norwegian team wintering on the ice. We saw one of these pictures, I think, in the last lecture. At the bottom, we see Amundsen on the far right at the end. They are preparing their clothing. We see the puppies and the actual base, the hut, the chimney that they built, a tent for supplies. So they are sitting there, building everything they need and building their strength and their mental state for striking out when summer comes. There are only 7 people, by the way. By then, they started 13. Amundsen left 8 people on the ship, and I'm sorry, 6 people on the ship, and 7 people on the ground. And later on, he will go to the pole with 6 people only, 6 men only. This was the plan. Everything was planned out. So here we see Amundsen route, and basically he was pioneering every inch of the way because no one made this route before. Unlike Scott, who was following Shackleton, he not only had to find a way to the pole, he also had to do it quickly. Every day and every hour counted. He had the twin burden of the discoverer and the long distance runner. And in the history of exploration, the challenge was really unique. This is written by Ronald Huntford, who wrote several wonderful books about going to the South Pole. And I gave you links to at least one of these books in the website. Whenever you have some time, I recommend reading it. Let me zoom in on the approach to the transatlantic range. So at some point, he reached these mountains, which he did not expect to see. He didn't know that the range that Shackleton went through, about 1,000 kilometers, southeast, was also existing here, and he had to somehow pass it, which was a formidable challenge. And passing it was very difficult because the valleys that went up the range were completely full with glaciers, and climbing these glaciers was extremely dangerous, especially when you do it with several dozens of dogs and sledges and tons of equipment, and you have only 7 people to help along the way. So he made several attempts to climb some of these glaciers and was unsuccessful. And at some point, he found a glacier that he managed to actually conquer. And this was a fantastic achievement. He made about 60 kilometers going uphill on this glacier, pushing up about 1.5 tons of supplies. And at the end, he finally got to the polar plateau. So, and also, and then you think that this would be an incredibly difficult thing to do. But in his memoirs, he writes, glistening white, shining blue, raven black, the land looks like a fairy tale. Pinnacle after pinnacle, peak after peak, crevassed, wild as any land on the globe. It lies unseen and untrodden. It is a wonderful feeling to travel along it. So, this man was not struggling for his life or anything. He was having a fun. He was having, the best time of his life in these extreme conditions. So once again, talk about differences of attitude. I see that Gal Lapid had a question.
Yeah, just a quick one. I'm really confused about the timeline. You said that Shackleton went after Scott, but Scott used the information of Shackleton's book before, and Nansen and Amundsen. I'm confused about the timelines.
In terms of timeline, it was very similar. They landed. I don't remember the exact dates, but I know that Amundsen landed just a few days after Scott, but about 700 kilometers west. They started roughly in the same time because they had to wait 8 months on the ice, and then when summer came in, they lost no time and they began the race to the pole. By the way, during the winter time, they were busy doing many things, and one of them was to begin going in the direction of the pole. And each expedition made a progress of about 500 kilometers, along which they laid depots and marked the way. They did everything that they could to ensure that when they will actually go out in several months' time, they will have as much food and fuel buried in the ground and as much marking as possible. So they were traveling pretty much in parallel time frames. This is a famous picture because not too many pictures were taken during these traveling to the pole. You see here a typical break at the end of the day when they stop and build tents or igloos or whatever it takes. You see the sledge meter, which is a bicycle wheel attached to the sled that tells you how much distance you made, and the dogs beginning to find places for night sleep and so on. That's another thing that I want to say about leadership style, that and the differences between the two teams. Scott was pushing his men in every step of the way. And one very important decision that you have to make on the ice is how much distance you want to cover every day. On average, you have to cover about 30 kilometers in order to make it each day. But Scott, when he had a good day and the weather was good and so on, he would push his men further. And instead of 30 kilometers, they would make 50, 60, even 70 kilometers. At the same time, Amundsen always made something like between 30 and 40 kilometers. And then even if it was the middle of the day, he stopped, built a tent, got out, the soup and the supplies and the tea, and began to set in for the rest for the next day. And he did it because he wanted his men to have a routine. Because one of the biggest problems in expeditions like this is uncertainty. And the more you can create a structure, the more you can build all sorts of ceremonies, like drinking tea together, the more the people will be relaxed and the more mental stamina they will have for the next day. That's one, additional difference in handling the two teams. So here we see the British, men hauling with incredible power and effort on the way. A sledge like this can weigh, between half a ton to a ton. So you can imagine, the pain and the effort that it takes to make progress. Now, at some point, Amundsen reached the pole. And on the one hand, an incredible milestone. On the other hand, when it actually happened, it was almost uneventful. The navigator Well, let me say a few words about how they actually made progress on the ice. They had this wonderful skier, Bjelland, and Amundsen would send Bjelland in front of everyone else. So Bjelland would ski about 2 kilometers before the first sledge. Now, this was extremely important because by forming a black spot in the infinite whiteness in front of them, it gave them a focal point. And the sledges and the men had a direction. They always followed Bjelland. So first Bjelland would go, then the sledges with the men running along the sledges and every once in a while hopping on the sledge. And Amundsen typically was at the end, behind, bringing up the rear. He very rarely led from the front, he led from behind. And so when they got, after about 2 months of travel, when they got to about 10 kilometers before the pole, the navigators stopped, Bjelland stopped, they called Amundsen forward and told him, maybe from now you have to lead the group. And everyone understood what was going on. They made another 10 or 15 kilometers. They made the final measurement with the sextant, and they realized that they were in the South Pole. So they stopped, they drank their tea, ate the soup, built a tent. They left a letter inside the tent describing who they are and what they did. And then they marked the tent very, very carefully. They had a special technique for marking depots. Basically, 4 people will stand on skis in sort of forming a cross and holding flags, black flags on poles. They would go for about, at the beginning, something like 100 meters and plant a flag, a pole with a black flag. Then they will go another 500 meters, plant another flag, another kilometer, another 2 kilometers. They formed something like 5 circles of black flags around the tent because they wanted to make sure that Scott or whoever else that will come there will not miss the tent. And Amundsen, being Amundsen, on every pole, these were wooden poles, on every pole there was a notch, in Hebrew, charitz, and the notch gave the direction where you had to go in order to find the next circle of flags, okay? So they reach the South Pole, 4 men. Interesting question, they began 7 and now they were only 4. I will maybe fill in this blank later on, but no one died. It wasn't a problem of death or something, but several people had to go back because of disciplinary problems. I will describe it later maybe. And they took this picture, and you can tell from the picture, you can actually tell from the body language that they were strong, they were happy, they were hopeful, and sort of full of awe to the moment that they were witnessing. A few days later, Scott reaches the pole and finds Amundsen tent. It was a terrible event, as you can imagine. They didn't find the tent first. They were going, through great agony and misery, fighting for their lives. And then all of a sudden, one of the men discerned a black spot in the whiteness. It was one of the flags that Amundsen left. And from this flag, they went to the next circle and the next, and then they found the tent and the letter, and they realized that they lost the race. It was like landing on the moon and finding a McDonald's restaurant on the moon. That's how they felt. And talk about body language, that's a picture that they took at the pole. You can tell from their faces that they're in a very bad shape, physically and mentally. And indeed, after reaching the pole, they begin a desperate race back to home base. They are out of food, out of fuel. One of the very bad preparations that were made before is that they're made, where Amundsen made something like 20 depots along the way, the British made something like 8 depots. So the depots were far away from each other. And in fact, that's what eventually led to the final disaster, because at some point they were hit by a storm and they sheltered themselves in a tent, as you see here. And the next depot was something like 200 kilometers from this tent, and they simply couldn't reach it. And they, when the days passed, they were stuck there for about a week. So day by day, they lost food, fuel. People began to die. And at some point, well, I'm going to skip a few slides because of lack of time. At some point, Scott writes in his diary, "Every day we have been ready to start for our depot." I'm sorry, only 11 miles away. My mistake, 11 miles away. But outside the door of the tent, it remains a scene of whirling drift. I do not think we can hope for better things now. We should stick it out to the end, in the great British tradition. But we are getting weaker, of course, and the end cannot be far. Now, Scott was actually a very good writer. And he wrote with great pathos, but this was a style back then. And you can see from his writing, it looks like up to the very last minute, he was playing to the British public. He was writing what people wanted to read. And he was hopeful that someone will actually find his diary, his journal, as in fact happened. Because what happened was that about 2 months later, an expedition went out from the base camp to look for them, and they found the tent, they found the bodies, they found the diary, and everything was left exactly, frozen exactly like the moment of death, with the skis stuck outside. Look at the picture. It's really heartbreaking. So they made it to the pole, second, and they didn't make it back. There's a nice little poem by Tennyson, actually the end of a long poem. Tennyson was a great British poet, also full of pathos. And he writes, "We are not now the strength which in old days moved earth and heaven. That which we are, one equal temper of heroic heart, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield." So they made it, they made it to the pole, but they didn't make it back. Small detail, but I think an important one. So what I planned to do, and in fact I will do it in the next lecture, is to stop here, look back at Scott and Amundsen, and compare the different leadership styles and the different actions that they made along the way. Because I think that there's a lot here to learn about leadership and character and planning. But once again, for lack of time, I will do it in the next lecture. So we have a few minutes left. If you have any questions, that's the time to bring them up. Gil, can you select a student?
Yeah.
I
Hi.
unmuted everyone so they can feel free to talk.
Okay, so if anyone wants to talk, just break in and talk.
Okay, so how many expeditions did Scott and Shackleton have in total? Because they went on alone, they went on together, any one of them, and Shackleton died 10 years later after Scott. So
Yes, so the first expedition was Scott and Shackleton together with Wilson. And this was, I think, was 1905, I don't remember exactly. And they make it to about 1,000 kilometers from the pole. Then several years later, Shackleton, with another two people, gets to 100 kilometers from the pole. And then 2 years later, Amundsen gets to the pole, and a few days later, Scott gets to the pole. And then several years later, Shackleton goes again on a very famous expedition that completely failed, but ended up being a fantastic achievement. And this is something about which we will talk in our next lecture. So Shackleton did not say yet the last word. Any other questions?
Yes, I actually have a question about the sledge meter, which you mentioned was a bicycle wheel that measured the distance that the sledge had traveled. And I was wondering how that worked.
Well, you know, it was just a wheel that turned around, and there was a mechanism in the wheel that counted how many revolutions the wheel made. It was incredibly inaccurate, but it gave you a rough idea of the distance that you made. And another way to measure the distance was to use the sextant, which was actually very accurate. And the sextant gave you a very good idea how far away you were from the pole.
Thank you.
Welcome. Okay, so I see that there are no other questions, and it's exactly 15 minutes past 5. So please read the text that I gave you for our next lecture, and I will see you next week. I think on Sunday, but I'm not sure. I will send you the exact Zoom link later. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, thank
Shimon.
you.
Chag
Thank you,
Sameach.
Shimon, it was great.
Thanks, Sameach.
חג
חג
שמח.
שמח.
תודה שמעון, חג
תודה,
שמח.
חג שמח.
כיף, תודה.
תודה רבה, חג שמח.
תודה שמעון, חג שמח.
ביי.
אולי שנה הבאה נתראה בקוטב.
מי יודע.
יש מי שבא איתי?
באיזה אתה רוצה? בדרומי או בצפוני?
יותר קל, אתה מכיר אותי.
אפשר לנצל את הזמן לשאול שאלה?
כן.
שמעתי איפשהו שבאחת המשלחות לקוטב הם אכלו את הכלבים שלהם לקראת סוף
זה בכל המשלחות, זה היה פרקטיקה סטנדרטית.
פה באמונדסן בחזור הם בעצם אוכלים את הכלבים?
כן, זה חלק מהעניין. הכלבים גם מושכים אותך וגם מאכילים אותך.
וואו.
כן. האמת שאחד הדיפוז של אמונדסן נקרא סלוטר דיפו. זה הנקודה שבה הם עצרו ושחטו את הכלבים, וזה היה כנראה משהו מאוד טראומטי לחבורה. אבל לא הייתה ברירה. tough life.
תודה לתשובה.
יאללה חבר'ה, אני צריך לעזוב, כי צריך ללמד עוד מעט עוד קורס, אז להתראות.
יאללה, חג שמח.
חג שמח, ביי.
חג שמח.